Good morning, everybody. Let's open your Bibles to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. And we've been talking about trusting in God. What does it mean to really trust God? And we use Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 almost as cliche. And most of us can quote it and randomly say it. And we randomly have said it to Christians. And I believe I've even found myself guilty for saying it to some Christians and some people. Just trust God and not realizing what it all entails and what it means to really trust God and what it means to get to that point where you can really trust God in your life as a Christian. In the day and age that we live in now, we really have to come to terms with that. What does it really mean to trust God? We're living in a crazy world. We're seeing things happen all around us by the moment, by the day. If you to turn on that news, things are happening. Life seems to be so hectic around us, and we don't know what the future really holds. But that's where we have to learn what it means to really trust God. And we talked about trusting God, and I kind of been blending all of these together, kind of like a bowl of mush or whatever you want to call it. But we've been talking about trusting God's protection, His provision, His person, and His providence. Understanding all of those and what it really means to trust God. And here we are in 2020, coming up on 21, and an election, and all these different things that have happened all around us in the world. And I mean, we have to really understand, well, what does it mean to trust God? And in my emotions, how am I feeling? What is going on in my emotions? And your emotions can be like an indicator. Are you really trusting God? And a lot of times our emotions will reveal even to ourselves. And when we line them up with the Word of God, it will reveal that we're really not trusting God. Our emotions are a big indicator of where you are. I mean, you guys all know what a barometer is. Everyone knows what a barometer is. And that barometer indicates the weather and different things that are happening. And so your emotions are an indicator. Are you really trusting God? And we're going to find that a lot of times our emotions will reveal to us that we're really not trusting God. And when I talk about emotions, I'm talking about all of the emotions: anger, fear, bitterness, doubt, jealousy, animosity, strife, frustration, all of these different mixed emotions. And so what we have is we have these areas where we do trust God, and then we find in these other areas of our own personal life where we're not necessarily trusting God. So we're going to use your emotions as an indicator about really, am I really trusting God in these scenarios, in these events in my life? And so here we are, we're trying to learn what it means to trust God. And all of these Old Testament characters that we've been using, all of them had to come to the point where they understood what it meant to trust God. And you're going to see that sometimes that their faith and their trust would fluctuate. You would see sometimes in their life that they didn't trust God. You would see sometimes when problems and persecutions and famines and all these different things would occur, they struggled with these things. When God called certain individuals to battle, they were apprehensive, they were unsure at different points. And then we've seen over and over that sometimes they trusted God. And so faith and trust, we talked about this, are intertwined as the same. They're separate, but yet they're intertwined. If you're going to have faith in God, you're going to have to trust God. And if you're going to trust God, you're going to have faith in God. And if you're going to trust God and have faith, you have to understand His protection, His provision, His person, and His providence. So here we are. We're going to be facing some things that are going to be coming up in the world that are completely obscure to us. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. But as we're seeing things happen, things are getting worse and worse. And we do know, that the scriptures must be what? They must be fulfilled. So there are things are going to get worse. So according to the Word of God, according to what God has revealed to us in the Bible, we know that things are going to get a lot worse. And so here we are. We have to trust God in what God is doing in our life. And I want you to look at this verse in Philippians really quick. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 6. Okay, so I've been giving you these other verses. We talked about Job chapter 13 and verse 5. And Job says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. We've seen that. And then also in the book of Corinthians, in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 is kind of our springboard of what we're doing. And then Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 26, he that trusteth in his own heart is a what? Is a fool, okay? But whosoever walketh wisely, he shall be delivered. So we know that we can't trust in our own heart. We know the Bible says, lean not on your own understandings, but in all ways acknowledge him in your direct path. Lean not on your own understanding. So we know these verses, okay? But now I want you to see something here in the book of Philippians really quick, right? And remember what Job says, though he slay me, I'm going to trust him, because Job understood God's protection, his providence. Job understood everything that God was. But look at this. It says, being confident of this very thing, that he which has begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. So God began a work in you. Okay, that work that he began in you is going to be performed until the day of Jesus Christ, which is the rapture of the church. So God began this work in you. God began to do something in you. And that's why God is working all things together for what? For good to them that love God. He's working all things together after the counsel of his own will. Okay, so we have to understand, God is always at work in your life. You may not think so, you may not understand it, but God is always, always at work. In the trials, in the tribulations, he's at work in the dark time in your life. He's at work in every little detail in your life. No matter what conspires in your life, God's hand is still there, molding and shaping you into the very image of Jesus Christ, because he never leaves you and he will never forsake you. That is the hand of a loving, gracious Father. Okay, so I want you to kind of, these verses that we look at on this concept of trusting God, I always try to get you to store them into the back of your mind. Now, let's go back to the book of Hebrews chapter 11 now. Hebrews chapter 11. Okay, Hebrews chapter 11, and I'm not going to continue to build on this study because I know you guys take notes and we have a lot of things that we had already looked at. But this morning I want to talk to you about Moses' mother, okay, in Hebrews chapter 11, and let's look at this in verse 23. It says, by faith Moses, when he was born, he was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw that he was a proper child. And look at this, they were not a what? Afraid of the king's commandments. I want to just kind of zone in, all right? They were not what? Afraid. They weren't fearful. They weren't worried. They weren't overly consumed. So all of a sudden, them trusting God gave them a boldness that was there in their life. Now, mind you, they could have been killed, or they would, without a doubt, they were going to take the children. What were they doing with them at that point? They were taking the babies and they were throwing them into the Nile River. And what do you know what lives in that river? Do you know what lives there? That river has crocodiles in there. The Nile crocodiles are some of the biggest crocodiles in the world. Never mind the poisonous snakes and everything else that river entails. Okay? And so they were throwing the man-children in there, and it would have cost them their life. But notice what their faith and trust did. Their faith and trust it extracts fear. Now, what true faith and trust in God does, it extracts fear. Is everyone with me on that? It removes fear. Listen, when you're trusting God, you're not worried about the alligators. You're not worried about the crocodiles. You're not worried about the snakes. You're not worried about any of those things because you are trusting God. They weren't afraid about losing their life. Listen, they could have, without a doubt, killed who? Moses' mom and Moses' dad would have been killed for hiding that child. They would have been killed, okay? But they had confidence and they had trust in God, so their fears were removed. Here, when a person is bound up with fear and worry, I'm telling you right now, that's a lack of faith and it's a lack of trust in God. We live in a society today where even Christians are literally being fearful over everything around them. And let me tell you something, that without a doubt is an indicator that it is without a doubt a lack of faith and a lack of trust. You have to understand that God is going to do what he's going to do in your life. God is going to work what he's going to work. If things happen, they happen for God's purpose and for God's glory. Okay? And the Bible talks about we faint not because, actually, let me turn over that scripture over there. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And drop down around there, let me see. I want you to pick it up in verse 15, right? I want you to look at this. For all things are for your sakes, that the abundance grace might through the thanksgiving of many redound to the glory of God. So whatever happens in your life is for God's what? For God's glory. For all things are for your sakes. Look at this, that the abundant grace might through the thanksgiving of many redound to the glory of God. For which cause we faint not, but though our outward man perish, the inward man is what? Is renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, what does it do? That light affliction worketh for us a far more exceedingly, look at this, an eternal weight of what? Glory. Of glory. Your affliction is working out a weight of glory. The more you're afflicted down here, the more you're going to glory up there. The more you face down here, the more you're going to be blessed on the other side. You understand that? And some of us don't even realize that. The sufferings and the problems and the difficulties we face down here, let me tell you something, it's going to be revealed to you in glory, and you're going to have more glory in God's presence and in God's throne. And so we have to begin to understand. This is why Paul writes this. When Paul is writing this, he understood he was going through adversity and struggle and conflict in his life. The life of Paul was a life of trial and tragedy. He was constantly being whipped. He was constantly being put in prison everywhere he went. But he understood that his afflictions were light. He understood that his problems were for the what? For the glory of God. Paul understood that. That's why he embraced those things. And he says, I take pleasure in what? Infirmities and necessities and reproaches. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And no, look at this. For our light afflictions is what for a moment? What does it do? Worketh for us a far more exceedingly eternal weight of glory. And then he says in verse 18, while we look not at the things that are seen, but at the things which are not seen. See? And for the things that are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Now, Paul understood that. I want you to turn back there to the book of Hebrews again. Now, let's look at this verse again. Hebrews in chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. Now, watch this in verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, he was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw that he was a proper child. They seen something that God was going to do with him. Did they have all of the inclinations filled out? No. But the Spirit of God revealed to them that their child was unique. Now, all of us think our children are unique, right? I mean, you have a baby, you're like, oh, this child is unique. It's different from every other one. And that's the way we think as parents. But they seen something in this child that was completely unique and different. And so God was encouraging them and strengthening them. Hey, just trust me. Hide the child. Take him and hide him for 3 months. And that's what they did. Even though their lives were in danger, even though that they would have literally been put to death by Pharaoh and the king of the king of Egypt. Now watch what it says here again, right? By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. They weren't afraid of the authority, pay attention people, that was over them. Do you understand that? They weren't afraid of the king's command. They weren't afraid of the rule or the reign that was in position over them, because they knew that they had something unique and they had faith and trust in God. Here we are, all right, and people, what is all around us is this whole concept of everything that's happening in this world. They are trying to project fear in people's lives. And don't tell me that that's not true. Listen, society today wants to project fear inside of people's lives, because through fear they can control people. It's fear that brings people to a place of submission. It's fear that allows people to submit to the authority that is above them. Listen, God didn't give us that spirit of fear. God didn't give us that spirit of fear. And fear will bring you down. But fear is an indicator that you are not trusting God. There are people walking around. I mean, everywhere you go, people are still bound up with fear. Everywhere you go. I mean, people are still overwhelmed with wearing the mask and keeping social distancing. I was in the store the other day, and I was standing there and I didn't have a mask on. I just pulled it down like this, and there was a guy standing there, and I moved up to get in line, and he stepped back. And then I moved over this way, and he stepped back. So now I turned it into a little game. I'm going like this. He goes like this. I go like this. The poor guy was ready to run out of the store. Here he is. He's so bound up with fear. I know some of you, Pastor Mike, that wasn't funny. That was funny. It was funny. If you seen it, it was funny. Every time I stepped closer, he would move. I'm looking at him, saying to myself, man. And let me tell you something, right? But people are so bound up with fear right now, they don't know whether they're coming or going because they're not trusting God. Listen, God's going to do what he's going to do. Do you understand that? He's God. He's God. I had a friend of mine who used to be afraid to fly. And he was petrified. He would never get in a plane. And I would say, hey, listen. His name was Jose. I said, Jose, God doesn't need to get you up there to kill you. If he wants to kill you, he can kill you on the ground. He doesn't need to get you, a couple miles up in the air to kill you. He can kill you right here, right now. And we have to understand that fear is an indicator that we're not trusting God. That is the number one indicator. Okay, your bills aren't paid, you get worried, you get stressed. Worry and stress and murmuring and complaining are another indicator that you're not trusting God. You say, Pastor Mike, that's not true. Yes, it is. Think about the nation of Israel. What did they start to do? They started to murmur and what? And complain that they didn't have food and water. And it's like, well, wait a second. God gave you water. God gave you manna. They had to eat the manna which would sustain them. But what they were doing is they weren't trusting God. They said, oh, it would have been better for us to have died or to go back to Egypt. No, it wouldn't have been better, because there you were a slave. And the problem is they weren't trusting God. They weren't trusting God's provision, so they started to complain. Complaining is an indicator that you're not trusting God. Frustration, another mixed emotion that we deal with. That's an indicator that you're not trusting God. So all of these things that we have that come into our life, when we identify with our own emotions, those are dictators and indicators that we are not trusting God. And so what we can do is you can look back at your life for the last couple of weeks and say, have I been afraid? Have I been complaining? Have I been frustrated? Have I been aggravated? Have I been bitter? Have I been angry? Anger is another cause of that. You know what else is? Think about this, right? We deal with our anger, and anger is nothing more than a frustration that comes out of us because we're not trusting God. Some of us will be angry about this, we'll be angry about that, or we're angry because of this happened in our life. We're angry because of that, Listen, God brought this and God brought that in your life. Accept it. Accept what He has done in your life. Accept what God is doing in your life. We've seen that in the life of Joseph. Joseph was never complaining. He was never murmuring. He was accepting what God was doing in his life. And then he finally said to his brothers, he says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for what? But God meant it for good. He understood that. He looked back and he said, man, God was working all things together for good. Yes, when I was in prison. Yes, when my brothers hated me. Yes, when I was falsely accused. Yes, when I was hoping to be delivered from prison, I remained there for several more years because he understood that God was doing what He had to do. God had to bring him where he needed to be. So let's look at this illustration now. Okay? We're talking about, he was not afraid of the king. They weren't afraid of the king's commandment. Notice what was the king's commandment. Okay, you deliver your children over to us and we kill them. If you hide them, what would we do? We would kill you. Okay, so here they're not afraid, as an indicator showing that they had true faith and true trust in God, because now there is no fear in their life. Now look at this, right? I want you to think about this. They're trusting God in a life or death situation. And I'm going to tell you, most of us have never had to trust God in a genuine life or death scenario. Most of our lives have been relatively easy. We haven't had real persecution in this country, thank God. We haven't had real sufferings in our life. Most of us haven't had real issues with bills and different things in our life. Let me tell you something. Very few of us have ever come to the point in a life or death scenario where we really had to trust God. Let's turn to Exodus now. Exodus chapter 21. Actually, Exodus 2, I'm sorry. Exodus chapter 2. Now look at this, right? And there went out a man of the house of Levi, and he took a wife, a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw that he was a goodly child, different from any other child, okay? Something unique, she knew. She has faith in the ability to trust God at this point in her life. She doesn't understand what's going to happen in the future. She has no idea. Her people are in bondage to the Egyptians right now. They're being afflicted. They're being tortured. They are going under immense persecution and immense struggle as the Jews at this point in their life. But this child is born, and she knows something is unique about him. Does she know that he's going to deliver the people from Egypt? She doesn't know that. Does she know that Moses is going to be the great leader one day and that God's hand is going to be upon him? She does not know that, nor does she understand that at this point. But she knows that something has to be done. She knows and understands, I have to do something now. And so what happens is her trust in God, it literally extracted her fear. She puts her faith and trust in God. Now all of a sudden she's like, I don't care what the king says. I don't care what the government says. I don't care what the ruler of the land say. I don't care. I have to do what God has called me to do, and that's to preserve and to protect this child. Okay? So she knows what she has to do. She doesn't understand all the implications of it, but she knows something has to be done. Now look at this, right? And when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of burlap, and look at this, and daunted it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And here she goes, and she laid it in the flags by the river brink, and the sister stood afar off to wit what would be done of him. She takes that baby, puts him in a basket, and puts him in the river, and just leaves him there. Okay? She walks away. Now, you know what trusting God is? Trusting God is letting go. We've all heard that expression. Trust God and let go. Trust God and let go. That woman takes her child, ladies, think about it, puts him in the river, turns her back on that child, and walks away. You want to talk about trusting God and where faith comes in? Something that she gave birth to, something that she loved. She's at a point now where she has to trust God. She has to trust him. Most of us have never really been into that type of predicament in a life or death scenario where we have to trust God. Some people are walking in fear right now. Christians are bound up with fear. I was talking to one Christian, and he had so much fear on him, I couldn't even believe it. He was literally bound up with fear. And I'm saying to myself, is this guy trusting God? Is he trusting God? Fear is an indicator that you're not trusting God. God didn't give us the spirit of fear. This woman had to literally let go of something that she loved. Now here's what happens. We get to a point where we want to continue to control things in our life. For 3 months, she did it. But she finally got to the point where she's like, I gotta put this in God's hands. I gotta put this in God's hands. You know what we do? Instead of us putting things in God's hands, we continue to control them with our own hands. That's where the frustration comes. That's where the murmuring comes. That's where the fear comes. That's where all these different mixed emotions comes, because you're not trusting God. You're working things in the power of yourself and in the power of your flesh. And what happens is then your emotions get the better of you because you're not trusting God. You show me somebody that's complaining, I'll show you somebody that's not trusting God. You show me somebody that's fearful right now because of what's happening in the world. That individual is not trusting God. They say, Pastor Mike, but what about this? What about that? What about this? What about it? The percentages of Moses' mother and Moses himself and father being put to death because she hid that child, the percentages was 100% death. Does everyone understand that? What are the percentages of somebody dying from the virus at this point?
Low.
What is it?
0.13% low.
Yeah, the percentage is nothing. And yet people not trusting God, walking in fear. Look what happens here, right? Because this gets good, because when you finally let go, then she receives the blessings. Look what happens here, right? So she puts him in the basket and pitch, and that's what she does. She just let go, right? And look at this by the brink. And his sister, Miriam, this is Moses' sister, she stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. She's like, I want to see what's going to happen to my little brother. I want to see my mother's faith. I want to see that my mom's trusting God, and that somehow, in some way, even though it seems absolutely crazy, that God's going to do something. To put that little baby in the river, it doesn't make any sense. But you know, when it comes to trusting God, sometimes it doesn't make sense. You just trust him. As Job says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Now look at this, right? And she laid, and his sister stood afar off to see what would be done unto him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the riverside. And when they saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maids to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept, and she had compassion on him. See what God's doing here? God took this woman's faith, all right, and he uses it to bring forth the leader of Israel, the great man of God, Moses. Guys, you have to understand this, right? There are things we have to learn to let go of before we can see the blessings of God in them. Sometimes we hold on to things. We want to do things in our own strength, in our own power, and not let go. Listen, you've got to let go of everything. And remember, your emotions are the indicator that you're still embracing things and doing things in the power of yourself. This is what we see in Christians. They're so fearful, they're afraid, they're complaining, they're murmuring, they're apprehensive. They have all these different mixed emotions. They're frustrated, they're angry. Why? Because they're not trusting God. And when you're not trusting God, you're not going to see the blessings. You're never going to see the power of God. You're never going to see the hand of God move. It was when she let go, the power of God was revealed. Now her name is written in, well, not her name, but the story is written in Hebrews chapter 11, the great hall of fame. Can't hang on. You've got to let go. Look at this, right? She sees the child weeps, and she has compassion on him. Only God could have worked that thing through. Only God could have protected the baby in the river. Only God could have worked it through where the daughter of Pharaoh comes walking out. Only God could put the timing together. Listen, time is controlled by God himself. God controls moments. God controls events. God controls all things in life. Listen, it was God that had that woman going out and walking at that time with her maidens. It was God that put compassion in her heart at that moment's time. It was God that worked the baby even to cry at the right time and to have such a look to him. It was God that was doing those things. It was God that does everything. And listen, we forget that God is involved in every moment and every second of our life. God doesn't stop working. The events that are happening in your life, they're all by the hand of God. The problems, the difficulties, the trials, the adversities, all of these things that we see, the problems we face with people, the problems we have that happen daily in our life, those things are from God. He's working moment by moment and second by second. The babe wept. And look at this, and she had compassion on him. Now you have to understand, she's the daughter of Pharaoh. Her father, the king, was taking those babies and throwing them into the Nile River, feeding them to the crocodiles. Her father. And she's going to bring home a Jewish baby? Now, think about it. Here she is, a pagan woman, filled with idolatry and idolism. And what is she doing? She's bringing home a child that was supposed to be put to death. What do you think her father did? See, God, the king's heart is in the what? Hand of the Lord. Guys, you gotta understand that God is working. You say, Pastor Mike, that just seems so outlandish. Well, that's how God works when you put your faith and trust in him. God can do exceedingly above all that we what? ask or even think. He can do anything because he's God. Now look what she says, right? She had compassion on him. She says, this is one of the Hebrew children. That's right. One of the Hebrew children that should have been put to death. And you're going to bring this baby home? God turned this woman's heart. Look at this. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said, I love this. Look at this. Said to her, go. And the maid went and called the child's what? You see that? You see what God does, man? God takes a scenario, right? And God can turn it around if you trust him. God takes the situations in our life that just seem, life or death situations. You just trust God. And God says, I'm going to turn that thing around and I'm going to work it together for good. Did she even remotely think that this was going to happen? No way. She did not know the outcome. But she didn't let her emotions control her any longer. She was no longer controlled by the fear of the king's command. She was no longer controlled by her emotions, and even the emotion of her love for the child. It didn't control her. You know what controlled her? It was trusting God. That's what controlled her. It was putting her faith and trusting God. Not knowing the outcome. Not knowing what was going to happen. Not knowing what God was going to do. And that's what faith is. It's blind faith. It's just trusting God. Letting go. In so many areas, we find ourselves not trusting God. Our emotions are the indicator. Our feelings are the indicator that we're not trusting God. The frustrations we feel, the bitterness, the anger, the fear, the doubt, the apprehension, all of these different mixed emotions are the very barometer or the indicator or the thermometer in proof that you're not trusting God. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. She called the mother. Now look at verse 9. In verse 9, and Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wife. Now she's getting paid for taking care of her own baby. You want to talk about a God that can do things? Come on, man. This is God we're talking about here. This is God, okay? Now God took this whole scenario, right, and he turned it around. You know, God takes things, right, in your life. If you will trust him, he will turn them around. He just takes things, right, and he just literally will just turn them around, and he will work them together for what? Good. For good. Now she's being paid for taking care and nursing her own child. Does she still know the outcome of Moses, what's going to do later on? No, she still doesn't know the outcome. But she knows and she's trusting God. Even though Romans chapter 8 verse 28 wasn't written yet, but it was written in the foreknowledge of God. And she was trusting God. Her fears were removed. Her murmurings, her doubts, her apprehensions were all removed. You don't see this woman being, oh no, what are we going to do? What's going to happen? What are we going to do? No. She's like, this is what we're going to do. Her and her husband. We're going to make a basket. We're going to put him in the basket. And we're just going to let him go down that river. And when she finally let go, I believe her fears were completely extracted. And God says, now you're going to see my hand work. Hey guys, we hold on to things. Primarily those emotions. Those emotions are the very indicator that we're not trusting God. You look back in the last year, month, few months, whatever, you see those different mixed emotions. Oh man, I didn't trust God here. It was time for me to tithe. I was afraid. I didn't trust God here. It was time for me to witness, and I was fearful. I didn't trust God in that witness. It was time for me to do this. I was frustrated. I was aggravated. I was complaining over here. I felt this way over here. Those are the indicators you look back on, and you say, man, I wasn't trusting God here. I wasn't trusting God there. See, when you trust God, you just let go. We all heard that expression, let go and what? Let God. Let God. You got to let go. She had to let go to the child that she loved. She had to let go of something that was so dear to her, of more value than anything that she probably ever lived for in her life. She had to let it go. But once she let it go, then the hand of God began to work. As long as she was going to hold on to that child, her life was in danger and the child's life was in danger as well. But she let go. Because why? Because she was truly trusting God. And then God took this whole scenario, and we know the story, and he turned it around for good. She had to trust God, that God, watch this, she had to trust God's protection. She had to trust God's provision. She had to trust God's person. And she had to trust God's providence, what he was going to do in the future. She had to trust his protection. The baby's in the Nile River. I know grown men that wouldn't go near that river because they're afraid of snakes. How many of you guys are afraid of snakes? Put your hand up. I'll bring one in next week and tell me you're not afraid.
I won't be here.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm telling you, right? There are people, they have poisonous frogs in that river too. Do you guys know that? Look some of the stuff up that's in that river.
A lot of nasty critters.
A lot of nasty critters in there. Anaconda, poisonous frogs, crocodile. Listen, she had to trust God's protection in a scenario where the chances of that child being killed were 100%, people. 100%. Not only that, but if an Egyptian stumbles upon a Jew, they would have killed that baby. But you know what she did? She trusted God. She trusted God. She had to trust God's protection. She had to trust his providence, that God was going to do what he was going to do. That God was going to bring that baby through, and just trust God. Guys, sometimes we don't know what God's going to do, but that's where faith and trust come together. Your emotions are the indicator that you're not trusting God. Fear, worry, apprehension, doubt, frustration, confusion, all of these mixed emotions that we feel. The Bible says she was not afraid of the king's what? Commandment. She wasn't afraid. Why? Because she was trusting God. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you and praise you for who you are, Lord. Thank you for these illustrations in the Bible that help us to understand your word more deeply and what it really means to trust you. I pray, Lord, just for people that are living in fear. And fear is the number one indicator that they're not trusting you, Lord. And doubt and worry and apprehension, frustration, confusion, murmuring, complaining, all of these different mixed emotions, bitterness, anger, like everything. Where we find these events happening in our life and we find our emotions getting the better of us. But we have to realize that you brought these things in our life. And that you are working all things together for good. Lord, help us to be like Moses' mom, a woman of faith, a woman of trust, where she had no fear, she had no apprehension. She just trusted you. And put her baby in a basket down the Nile River. Lord, help us to have that trust and that faith in you, Lord. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen.